Okay, so we're back, and this is the last lecture of Chapter 2, which is neurobiology. And there's really just a couple really important concepts, but there's just a couple concepts left to cover. The last lecture, number 9, we were talking about the somosensory cortex and the peripheral nervous system. In this 10 minutes or so, I want to talk about what we mean by the plastic brain and the endocrine system, and wrap up with a question about genetic vulnerability. Okay, so this is an important concept, what is meant by the plastic system, or the plastic brain. So there are two kinds of plasticity. Well, let me back up. Plasticity refers to that the brain is malleable. So if you consider the difference between, say, steel and plastic, plastic can be shaped. It can be molded and made into something different. I mean, steel can too, but it's much harder, right? Plastic. So plastic meaning that it's shapeable. Structural, functional plasticity refers to that when there is damage to the brain, those functions can shift to someplace else, right? So I don't know if it was in this video lecture or if it was another class, but when my mother's partner had a stroke, and clearly that part of the brain died, but the doctors told him to continue to read, they were hedging for or hoping for some functional plasticity. In other words, they were hoping that the brain, that the function of reading would shift, right? And in fact, he did gain some of his ability to read back. Structural plasticity is when the brain literally changes shape. And this one is kind of when the brain literally changes shape, so the structures change. Some of the classic examples of structural plasticity comes out of some contemporary research that looks at post-traumatic stress and depression. And some of the evidence suggests that people who suffer from these conditions have a atrophied amygdala. You'll remember the amygdala is from the limbic system. It's from it's that anger, fear, and anger system. And what the researchers are questioning or wondering about is depression and PTSD because the amygdala is smaller, or does the amygdala literally change shape because one is suffering from depression or post-traumatic stress? And of course, how would we answer that question? Well, we would have to measure people's amygdala before and after they had a traumatic experience, and then hope that their amygdala shrank because of their depression or their post-traumatic stress. And then we could say, oh, okay, so it changes shape, but that's still sort of the question. Another hint that the brain may change shape may change structures in response to the environment is an interesting observation about dopamine and obesity. And I think somewhere in here I'll have some images of it, but obese people appear to have fewer dopamine receptors. You'll remember dopamine is that neurotransmitter that makes you feel good, right? It's the reward that keeps you coming back for more. So one theory is that maybe this suggests that people who are obese don't get the same sort of dopamine rush. They don't get the same pleasure from eating that other people do. So therefore they eat more because they don't get as much pleasure. Or another way, again, it's that chicken or the egg argument, or maybe the other question would be, do the brains of obese people, do they have fewer receptors because the brain says, dude, you don't need to eat so much. We're going to take some receptors away so that you don't get as much pleasure. It's still unknown, but there does appear to suggest that structurally there is a difference. So that's what we mean by evidence of plasticity. So suggests experience change the brain. We certainly know that certain nutritional inputs can change the way the brain works. When there is brain damage, some of those paths can be rewired, like in the discussion about John, my mom's partner, who had the stroke, and he was able to regain some of his ability to read. People who lose the ability to walk can relearn how to walk, and part of walking is neurological development. And then finally, really important word right here, it's in bold letters, and I mentioned it before, is neurogenesis. And neurogenesis is the most basic form of neural structural plasticity, and that is the birth of new neurons, right? I mean, you can't change your brain shape any more than getting new neurons. Neuro meaning neurological, brain, genesis meaning new. And this happens in the hippocampus, and that's that long wall. You'll see more pictures of it later. Okay. The last part of the neurological system is the endocrine system. On the quiz, there is traditionally a question, what do endocrinologists study? The endocrine system is another word for hormones, or as I've said before, her whores are moaning. The endocrine system is your hormone system. Endocrinologists study your hormone system. Your hormones, the only difference between, your hormones are like neurotransmitters. They tell your structure, other structures in your body what to do. The difference between a neurotransmitter and a hormone is where it is at. When these neurological chemicals are found in your blood, we call them hormones. When the neurological chemicals are found in your brain, we call them neurotransmitters. My understanding is they are molecularly the same. Some of the hormones also move, or their effects are slower. And that has partly to do with the relationship between the signals. So when the neurotransmitters are communicating, it's happening very quickly amongst all this important mechanics, all this important machinery. But your hormones, so there'll be a signal to the pituitary gland, which is a little bitty gland in the middle of the head, and it'll say, oh, your adrenal glands need to do something. So the pituitary gland has to tell the adrenal glands, which are both the kidneys, oh, you need to get the ovaries to release something. And so it takes a lot, the communication is a lot slower. And then once the hormones release something, then of course you have to wait for enough of it to get into your bloodstream before it affects how you feel. So it's slower and it's in your bloodstream. That's a quiz question, is what is the difference between hormones and neurotransmitters? They're slower, they're in your blood. Some of the really fun ones to talk about are you got oxytocin. Oh, oxytocin is the best. This is a hormone, and all women and men have all the same hormones. The difference is the concentration. Women have testosterone, men have estrogen. We just don't have quite as much of it. Oxytocin is one that women have more of than men do, and there are times in a reproductive woman's life where she has spikes in oxytocin, and it'll leave her feeling really good and just, oh, she just is so in love. One of those times is when she is in labor, right? Labor is called labor because it is very difficult and very painful, and you must push this thing the size of a watermelon out of a very small hole, and it's very painful, right? But because this causes your really high levels of oxytocin, what's a typical reaction after a mother sees her baby for the first time? They're just so in love with it. Instead of being all like, oh my God, you just ripped me in two, they're just, oh, they love these. That's because of oxytocin. The second time, or another time, is when she is breastfeeding. And breastfeeding is kind of the same thing, right? It's essential, or at least think evolutionarily, essential for the survival of her very, very dependent child, very, very dependent baby. And it's really like chewing on her breast. And this can hurt, right? And it can be very, what's the word I'm looking for? Not punitive, but very, where you're burdened. You can be very burdensome to breastfeed. But it causes your oxytocin levels to go up. And so instead of thinking, oh no, not again, you're like, oh, aren't you just beautiful? Sure, you can sit here and chew on my body parts, right? That's oxytocin. And the third time, which is also about reproduction, is actually during orgasm. And she has these very high levels of oxytocin that just leads her just to love you so much. So those, what do they call that? Pillow talk, right? All because of oxytocin. And the thought is that this, and it's quite, it has a quite a short, it has a short half-life. You can actually buy syringes on the internet and you can inject people with oxytocin. It makes people feel a sense of calm, trusting, bonding. It's a very pro-social hormone. There's some interesting research that sets people up in a monopoly game, and they expose some of the folks to oxytocin, and they share more of their money. On the other hand, the other hormone that sort of does the opposite of oxytocin, do you want to take a guess what that is? Testosterone, right? So men have more testosterone. In this experiment where they gave more oxytocin to half the group that was playing, they shared more money. In the group that gave, or in the part of the group where they gave them more testosterone, they were more aggressive and they didn't share at all, right? They were more competitive. So both of these hormones are kind of important to our survival of the species, but they have sort of polar implications. Men indeed have more testosterone than women. Women have more oxytocin than men. I'll leave it to you if that's what explains the differences between men and women. Just stop right there. So another set of, and I'm aware of my time here, so I want to go through these quickly. But another set of hormones are the endorphins, which I kind of already talked about. You have the endogenous and the exogenous. The problem with ingesting exogenous like heroin and morphine is your body quits producing the endogenous one. And imagine if you could feel every hangnail, every cut, everything wrong with you, you would hurt really bad. That is why narcotics, which are exogenous endorphins, are so highly, highly addictive, because when your body quits producing them, you feel really bad. Let's see, epinephrine or adrenaline, they use this as basic adrenaline. This is part of the sympathetic nervous system. It causes to increase your heart rate, increase the blood flow to your trunk, to your heart, to your legs, to your major muscle groups, and away from your appendages. You don't think, your fingers get cold, your toes get cold, you stop digesting, because it's all about your trunk fighting or flying, fighting or fleeing, fight, flight, or flee. Fight, flight, or freeze. That's what it is. So you either run, or you fight, or you freeze. And that's all adrenaline. And then norepinephrine, which we've already talked about. Those are the EpiPens, right? Those are the EpiPens. My last talk, the last topic, we're going a little over my 10-minute mark, but this is sort of the last topic. And it's a really important concept that probably will show up in a discussion post, and that is what we mean by genetic vulnerability. Right, so the big question, going back to the first chapter, to probably the first video lecture, is nature versus nurture. How much of who we are is because our body is built that way? How much of who we are is influenced by the environment, right? Is happiness genetic? Is obesity genetic? Are these things in our genes, or are these things from without? Sociology, we're not in social, but in social would say it's all exclusively from without. Psych, though, allows us to ask the question and try to tease out how much of who we are is our biology and how much of who we are is our environment. What psychologists have uncovered, and I have to say that even as a trained sociologist, I'm on board with this idea, is this idea of genetic vulnerability or biological predisposition. Kind of means the same thing. But what genetic vulnerability means is that we have inherited the genetic possibility of something, but it won't necessarily happen unless it is environmentally triggered. So an example would be, there is some evidence that addiction, that the tendency to develop brain processes where we overdo too much food, too much exercise, too much sex, too much drugs, there is some evidence that says that we inherit brain structures that make it likely for us to develop these patterns. But the question is, if I've inherited the tendency to develop alcoholism, but I'm never exposed to alcohol, will I become an alcoholic? Am I an alcoholic? And I'll leave you to think about that question yourself. But what it means to be genetically vulnerable, and this is important because it is a quiz question, and I think a midterm question too. What that means is that I am more likely to develop a certain condition than somebody who didn't inherit the genetic vulnerability. I'll use myself as an example. Addictions run in my family. My mother's a food addict. My grandfather on my mother's side was an alcoholic. My grandmother on my father's side was an alcoholic. I have inherited the brain structures to become an alcoholic or to become addicted to something. If I never am in an environment where I have access to alcohol or I have access to extra food or have opportunity to exercise too much, I probably won't develop those addictions. But I'm more likely to, and knowing that I have that genetic vulnerability means that I should be more cautious, because which really gets me, and actually I do struggle a little bit with too much alcohol. What really gets me is that some people don't have this genetic vulnerability, so they'll never, well, or they're way less likely. Continuing on that path, right? So my kids, my mother's a food addict. I'm probably I drink too much. I struggle with alcohol consumption. My grandfather, my grandmother, my husband is a cigarette smoker. What do you suppose that the odds are that my children inherited a brain structure to develop some addictive behaviors? To know that they are genetically vulnerable, they're more vulnerable than, say, somebody else to become an alcoholic, means they can use that information and influence. They can use that information and as they make choices about what environments to be in. I hope that makes some sense. We'll talk about biological predispositions too. For instance, biological predisposition means that we're biologically programmed to hold on to weight, not to lose weight. We're biologically predisposed to be afraid of heights because we can't fly. Does that mean we can overcome our heights? Yes, it does. But our biology is programmed so that we will be afraid of heights. Okay, I'm gonna wrap this up for now. Thank you for hanging out with me. This wraps up chapter 2. The next topic will be, I don't remember, I'll have to look. It's either, hold on. The next topic, is states of consciousness, dreams and drugs and sleep. Okay, bye-bye for now.